Oh, this is a continuance of Roald Dahl's James and the Giant Peach. "We're off!" someone was shouting. "We're off at last!" James woke up with a jump and looked about him. The creatures were all out of their hammocks and moving excitedly around the room. Suddenly the floor gave a great heave as though an earthquake were taking place. "Here we go!" shouted the old green grasshopper, hopping up and down with excitement. "Hold on tight!" "What's happening?" cried James, leaping out of his hammock. "What's going on?" The ladybird, who was obviously a kind and gentle creature, came over and stood beside him. "In case you don't know it," she said, "we are about to depart forever from the top of this ghastly hill that we've all been living on for so long. We are about to roll away inside this great big beautiful peach to a land of what?" asked James. "Never you mind," said the ladybird, "but nothing could be worse than this desolate hilltop and those two repulsive aunts of yours." "Hear, hear," they all shouted. "Hear, hear." "You may not have noticed it," the ladybird went on, "but the whole garden, even before it reaches the steep edge of the hill, happens to be on a steep slope, and therefore the only thing that has been stopping this peach from rolling away right from the beginning is the thick stem attaching it to the tree. Break the stem and off we go." "Watch it!" cried Miss Spider as the room gave her another violent lurch. "Here we go!" "Not quite, not quite." "At this moment," continued the ladybird, "our centipede, who has a pair of jaws as sharp as razors, is up there on top of the peach and nibbling away at that stem. In fact, he must be nearly through it, as you can tell from the way we're lurching about. Would you like me to take you under my wing, so that you won't fall over when we start rolling?" "That's very kind of you," said James, "but I think I'll be all right." Just then the centipede stuck his grinning face through a hole in the ceiling and shouted, "I've done it! We're off!" "We're off!" the others cried. "We're off!" "The journey begins!" shouted the centipede. "And who knows where it will end?" muttered the earthworm. "If you have anything to do with it, it can only mean trouble." "Nonsense," said the ladybird. "We are now about to visit the most marvellous places and see the most wonderful things. Isn't that so, centipede?" "There's no knowing what we shall see," cried the centipede. "We may see a creature with 49 heads who lives in the desolate snow, and whenever he catches a cold which he dreads, he has 49 noses to blow. We may see the venomous pink-spotted scrunch who can chew up a man with one bite. It likes to eat 5 of them roasted for lunch and 18 for its supper at night. We may see a dragon and nobody knows that we won't see a unicorn there. We may see a terrible monster with toes growing out of the tufts of his hair. We may see the sweet little biddy bright hen, so playful, so kind and well-bred. And such beautiful eggs, you just boil them and then they explode and blow off your head. A gnu and a gnothorus surely we'll see, and that enormous and gnorrible gnat, whose sting when it stings you goes in at the knee and comes out through the top of your hat. We may even get lost and be frozen by frost We may die in an earthquake or tremor, or nastier still, we may even be tossed on the horns of a furious dilemma. But who cares? Let us go from this horrible hill. Let us roll, let us bowl, let us plunge. Let us go rolling and bowling and spinning until we're away from old Spiker and Sponge. 1 second later, slowly, insidiously, oh, most gently, the great Peach started to lean forward and steal into motion. The whole room began to tilt over and all the furniture went sliding across the floor and crashed against the far wall. So did James and the ladybird and the old green grasshopper and Miss Spider and the earthworm and also the centipede, who had just come slithering quickly down the wall. Outside in the garden at that very moment, Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker had just taken their places at the front gate, each with a bunch of tickets in her hand, and the first stream of early morning sightseers was visible in the distance, climbing up the hill to view the Peach. "We shall make a fortune today," Aunt Spiker was saying. "Just look at all those people."
"I wonder what became of that horrid little boy of ours last night,"
Aunt Sponge said.
"He never did come back in, did he?"
"He probably fell down in the dark and broke his leg," Aunt Spiker said.
"Or his neck, maybe,"
Aunt Sponge said hopefully. "Just wait till I get my hands on him," Aunt Spiker said, waving her cane. "He'll never want to stay out all night again by the time I finish with him. Good gracious me! What's that awful noise?" Both women swung round to look. The noise, of course, had been caused by the giant Peach crashing through the fence that surrounded it, and now gathering speed every second it came rolling across the garden towards the place where Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker were standing. They gaped. They screamed. They started to run. They panicked. They both got in each other's way. They began pushing and jostling, and each one of them thinking only about saving herself. Aunt Sponge, the fat one, tripped over a box that she had brought along to keep the money in and fell flat on her face. Aunt Spiker immediately tripped over Aunt Sponge and came down on top of her. They both lay on the ground, fighting and clawing and yelling and struggling frantically to get up again. But before they could do this, the mighty Peach was upon them. There was a crunch, and then there was silence. The Peach rolled on, and behind it Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker lay ironed out upon the grass as flat and thin and lifeless as a couple of paper dolls cut out of a picture book. And now the Peach had broken out of the garden and was over the edge of the hill, rolling and bouncing down the steep slope at a terrific pace. Faster and faster it went, and the crowds of people who were climbing up the hill suddenly caught sight of this terrible monster plunging down upon them, and they screamed and scattered to right and left as it went hurtling by. At the bottom of the hill it charged across the road, knocking over a telegraph pole and flattening 2 parked cars as it went by. Then it rushed madly across the 20 fields, breaking down all the fences and hedges in its path. It went right through the middle of a herd of fine Jersey cows, and then through a flock of sheep, and then through a paddock full of horses, and then through a yard full of pigs, and soon the whole countryside was a seething mass of panic-stricken animals stampeding in all directions. The Peach was still going at a tremendous speed, with no sign of slowing down, and about a mile further on it came to a village. Down the main street of the village it rolled, with people leaping frantically out of its path left and right, and at the end of the street it went crashing right through the wall of an enormous building and out the other side, leaving 2 gaping round holes in the brickwork. This building happened to be a famous factory where they made chocolate, and almost at once a great river of warm melted chocolate came pouring out of the holes in the factory wall. A minute later, this brown, sticky mess was flowing through every street in the village, oozing under the doors of houses and into people's shops and gardens. Children were wading in it up to their knees, and some were even trying to swim in it, and all of them were sucking it into their mouths in great greedy gulps and shrieking with joy. But the peach rushed on across the countryside, and on, and on, and on, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Cowsheds, stables, pigsties, barns, bungalows, hayricks, anything that got in its way went toppling over like a ninepin. An old man sitting quietly beside a stream had his fishing rod whisked out of his hands as it went dashing by, and a woman called Daisy Entwistle was standing so close to it as it passed that she had the skin taken off the tip of her long nose. Would it ever stop? Why should it? A round object will always keep on rolling as long as it is on a downhill slope, and in this case the land sloped downhill all the way until it reached the ocean. The same ocean that James had begged his aunts to be allowed to visit the day before. Well, perhaps he was going to visit it now. The peach was rushing closer and closer to it every second, and closer also to the towering white cliffs that came first. These cliffs are the most famous in the whole of England, and they are hundreds of feet high. Below them, the sea is deep and cold and hungry. Many ships have been swallowed up and lost forever on this part of the coast, and all the men who were in them as well. The peach was now only 100 yards away from the cliff, now 50, now 20, now 10, now 5, and when it reached the edge of the cliff it seemed to leap up into the sky and hang there suspended for a few seconds till turning over and over in the air, and then it began to fall down. Down, 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 smack! It hit the water with a colossal splash and sank like a stone. But a few seconds later, up it came again, and this time up it stayed, floating serenely upon the surface of the water. At this moment, the scene inside the peach itself was one of indescribable chaos. James Henry Trotter was lying bruised and battered on the floor of the room amongst a tangled mass of centipede and earthworm and spider and ladybird and glowworms and old green grasshopper. In the whole history of the world, no traveller had ever had a more terrible journey than these unfortunate creatures. It had started out well with much laughing and shouting, and for the first few seconds as the peach had begun to roll about a little bit, and then it went bump, and the centipede had shouted, "That was Aunt Sponge!" And then bump again, and that was Aunt Spiker. There had been a tremendous burst of cheering all round. But as soon as the peach rolled out of the garden and began to go down the steep hill, rushing and plunging and bounding madly downwards, then the whole thing became a nightmare. James found himself being flung up against the ceiling, then back on the floor, then sideways against the wall, and then up on the ceiling again, and then up and down and back and forth and round and round. And at the same time, all the other creatures were flying through the air in every direction, and so were the chairs and the sofa, not to mention the 42 boots belonging to the centipede. Everything and all of them were being rattled around like peas in an enormous rattle that was being rattled by a mad giant who refused to stop. To make matters worse, something went wrong with the glowworm's lighting system, and the room was in pitchy darkness. There were screams and yells and curses and cries of pain, and everything kept going round and round. And once James made a frantic grab at some thick bars sticking out from the wall, only to find that they were a couple of the centipede's legs. "Let go, you idiot!" shouted the centipede, kicking himself free, and James was promptly flung across the room into the old green grasshopper's horny lap. Twice he got tangled up in Miss Spider's legs. A horrid business. And towards the end, the poor earthworm, who was cracking himself like a whip every time he flew through the air from one side of the room to the other, coiled himself around James's body in a panic and refused to unwind. Oh, it was a frantic and terrible trip. But It was all over now, and the room was suddenly very still and quiet. Everybody was beginning slowly and painfully to disentangle himself from everybody else. "Let's have some light," shouted the centipede. "Yes," they cried, "light, give us some light." "I'm trying," answered the poor glowworm. "I'm doing my best. Please be patient." They all waited in silence. Then a faint greenish light began to glimmer out of the glowworm's tail, and this gradually became stronger and stronger until it was, anyway, enough for them to see by. "Some great journey," the centipede said, limping across the room. "I shall never be the same again," murmured the earthworm. "Nor I," the ladybird said. "It's taken years off my life." "But, my dear friends," cried the old green grasshopper, trying to be cheerful, "we are there." "Where?" they asked. "Where? Where is there?" "I don't know," the old green grasshopper said, "but I'll bet it's somewhere good." "We're probably at the bottom of a coal mine," said the earthworm gloomily. "We certainly went down and down and down very suddenly at the last moment. I felt it in my stomach. I still feel it." "Perhaps we are in the middle of a beautiful country full of songs and music," the old green grasshopper said. "Or near the seashore," said James eagerly, "with lots of other children down on the sand for me to play with." "Pardon me," murmured the ladybird, turning a trifle pale. "But am I wrong in thinking that we seem to be bobbing up and down?" "Bobbing up and down?" they cried. "What on earth do you mean?" "You're still giddy from the journey," the old green grasshopper told her. "You'll get over it in a minute. Is everybody ready to go upstairs now and take a look around?" "Yes, yes," they chorused. "Come on, let's go." "I refuse to show myself out of doors in my bare feet," the centipede said. "I have to get my boots on again first." "For heaven's sake, let's not go through all that nonsense again," the earthworm said. "Let's all lend the centipede a hand and get it over with," the ladybird said. "Come on." So they did, all except Miss Spider, who set about weaving a long rope ladder that would reach from the floor up to the hole in the ceiling. The old green grasshopper had wisely said that they must not risk going out of the side entrance when they didn't know where they were, but must first of all go up onto the top of the peach and have a look round. So, half an hour later, when the rope ladder had been finished and hung and the 40-second boot had been laced neatly onto the centipede's 42nd foot, they were all ready to go out. Amidst shouting, mounting excitement and shouts of, "Here we go, boys, the promised land, I can't wait to see it," the whole company climbed up the ladder one by one and disappeared into a dark, soggy tunnel in the ceiling that went steeply, almost vertically, upwards. A minute later they were out in the open, standing on the very top of the peach near the stem, blinking their eyes in the strong sunlight and peering nervously around. "What happened? But where are we? But this is impossible, unbelievable, terrible. I told you we were bobbing up and down," the ladybird said. "We're in the middle of the sea," cried James, and indeed they were. A strong current and a high wind had carried the peach so quickly away from the shore that already the land was out of sight. All around them lay the vast black ocean, deep and hungry. Little waves were bibbling against the sides of the Peach. "But how did this happen?" they cried. "Where are the fields? Where are the woods? Where is England?" Nobody, not even James, could understand how in the world a thing like this could come about. "Ladies and gentlemen," the old green grasshopper said, trying very hard to keep the fear and disappointment out of his voice, "I am afraid that we find ourselves in a rather awkward situation."
"Awkward!" cried the earthworm. "My dear old grasshopper, we are finished. Every one of us is about to perish. I may be blind, you know, but that much I can see quite clearly."
"Off with my boots!" shouted the centipede. "I cannot swim with my boots on."
"I can't swim at all," cried the ladybird.
"Nor can I," wailed the glowworm. "Nor I," said Miss Spider. "None of us three girls can swim a single stroke." "But you won't have to swim," said James calmly. "We are floating beautifully, and sooner or later a ship is bound to come along and pick us up." They all stared at him in amazement.
"Are you quite sure that we are not sinking?" the ladybird asked.
"Of course I'm sure," answered James. "Go and look for yourselves." They all ran over to the side of the Peach and peered down at the water below. "The boy is quite right," the old green grasshopper said. "We are floating beautifully. Now we must all sit down and keep perfectly calm. Everything will be all right in the end."
"What absolute nonsense!" cried the earthworm. "Nothing is ever all right in the end, and well you know it."
"Poor earthworm," the ladybird said, whispering in James's ear.
"He loves to make everything into a disaster. He hates to be happy. He is only happy when he is gloomy. Now isn't that odd? But then I suppose just being an earthworm is enough to make a person pretty gloomy. Don't you agree?"
"If this Peach is not going to sink," the earthworm was saying, "and if we're not going to be drowned, then every one of us is going to starve to death instead. Do you realise we haven't had a thing to eat since yesterday morning?" "By golly, he's right," cried the centipede. "For once, earthworm is right."
"Of course I'm right," the earthworm said.
"And we're not likely to find anything round here either. We shall get thinner and thinner and thirstier, and we shall all die a slow and grisly death from starvation. I'm dying already. I'm slowly shrivelling up for want of food. Personally, I would rather drown." "But good heavens, you must be blind," said James.
"You know very well I'm blind," snapped the earthworm. "There's no need to rub it in."
"I didn't mean that," said James quickly. "I'm sorry, but can't you see that—"
"See!"
shouted the earthworm. "How can I see if I'm blind?" James took a deep, slow breath. "Can't you realise," he said patiently, "that we have enough food here to last for weeks and weeks?" "Where?" they said. "Where?" "Why, the Peach, of course. Our whole ship is made of food." "Jumping Jehoshaphat!" they cried. "We've never thought of that." "My dear James," said the old green grasshopper, laying a front leg affectionately on James's shoulder, "I don't know what we'd do without you. You are so clever. Ladies and gentlemen, we are saved again."
We are most certainly not, said the earthworm.
You must be crazy. You can't eat the ship. It's the only thing that is keeping us up. We shall starve if we don't, said the centipede.
And we shall drown if we do,
cried the earthworm.
Oh dear, said the old green grasshopper. Now we're worse off than before.
Couldn't read just a little bit of it? Asked Miss Spider.
I am so dreadfully hungry.
You can eat all you want, James answered. It would take us weeks and weeks to make any sort of a dent in this enormous peach. Surely you can see that. Good heavens! He's right again! Cried the old green grasshopper, clapping his hands. It would take weeks and weeks. Of course it would. But let's not go making a lot of holes all over the deck. I think we'd better simply scoop it out of that tunnel over there, the one that we've just come up by.
An excellent idea, said the ladybird.
What are you looking so worried about, earthworm? The centipede asked. What's the problem?
The problem is, the earthworm said, the problem is that there is no problem.
Everyone burst out laughing. Cheer up, earthworm, they said. Come and eat. And they all went over to the tunnel entrance and began scooping out great chunks of juicy golden-coloured peach flesh.
Oh, marvellous, said the centipede, stuffing it into his mouth.
Delicious, said the old green grasshopper.
Just fabulous, said the glowworm.
Oh my, said the ladybird primly.
What a heavenly taste!
And she looked up at James and she smiled, and James smiled back at her. They sat down on the deck together, both of them chewing away happily.
You know, James, the ladybird said, up until this moment I have never in my life tasted anything except those tiny little green flies that live on the rose bushes. They have a perfectly delightful flavour, but this peach is even better.
Isn't it glorious? Miss Spider said, coming over to join them. Personally, I had always thought that a big, juicy, caught-in-the-web blue bottle was the finest dinner in the world until I tasted this. What a flavour! The centipede cried. It's terrific! There's nothing like it. There never has been. And I should know because I personally have tasted all the finest foods in the world. Whereupon the centipede, with his mouth full of peach and with juice running down all over his chin, suddenly burst into song.
I've eaten many strange and scrumptious dishes in my life, like jellied nuts and dandy-prats and earwigs cooked in slime, and mice with rice, they're really nice when roasted in their prime. But don't forget to sprinkle them with just a pinch of grime. I've eaten fresh mud burgers by the greatest cooks there are, and scrambled dregs and stinkbugs' eggs, and hornets stewed in tar, and pails of snails and lizards' tails and beetles by the jar. A beetle is improved by just a splash of vinegar. I often eat boiled slobbages, they're grand when served besides. Minced doodlebugs and curried slugs, and have you even tried mosquitoes' toes and wampfish roes, most delicately fried? The only trouble is they disagree with my inside. I'm mad for crispy wasp things on a piece of buttered toast, and pickled spines of porcupines, and then a gorgeous roast of dragon's flesh, well hung not fresh. It costs £1 at most, and comes to you in barrels if you ordered it by post. I crave the tasty tentacles of octopi for tea. I like hot dogs, I love hot frogs, and surely you'll agree
A plate of soil with engine oil's a super recipe. I hardly need to mention that it's practically free. For dinner on my birthday, shall I tell you what I chose? Hot noodles made from poodles on a slice of garden hose, and a rather smelly jelly made of armadillo's toes. The jelly is delicious, but you have to hold your nose. Now comes, the centipede declared, the burden of my speech. These foods are rare beyond compare, some are right out of reach. But there's no doubt I'd go without a million plates of each, for one small mite, one tiny bite of this fantastic peach. Everybody was feeling happy now. The sun was shining brightly out of a soft blue sky, and the day was calm. The giant peach, with the sunlight glinting on its side, was like a massive golden ball sailing upon a silver sea. "Look!" cried the centipede, just as they were finishing their meal. "Look at that funny thin black thing gliding through the water over there." They all swung round to look. "There are two of them," said Miss Spider. "There are lots of them," said the ladybird. "What are they?" asked the earthworm, getting worried. "They must be some kind of fish," said the old green grasshopper. "Perhaps they have come to say hello." "They're sharks!" cried the earthworm. "I'll bet you anything you like they're sharks, and they've come to eat us up." "Oh, what absolute rot!" the centipede said, but his voice seemed suddenly to have become a little shaky, and he wasn't laughing. "I am positive they are sharks," said the earthworm. "I just know they are sharks." And so, in actual fact, did everybody else, but they were too frightened to admit it. There was a short silence. They all peered down anxiously at the sharks, who were cruising slowly round and round the peach. "Just assuming they are sharks," the centipede said, "they still can't possibly be any danger if we stay up here." But even as he spoke, one of those thin black fins suddenly changed direction and came cutting swiftly through the water right up to the side of the peach itself. The shark paused and stared up at the company with small evil eyes. "Go away!" they shouted. "Go away, you filthy beast!" Slowly, almost lazily, the shark opened his mouth, which was big enough to swallow a perambulator, and made a lunge at the peach. They all watched aghast. And now, as though at a signal from the leader, all the other sharks came swimming in towards the peach, and they clustered around it and began to attack it furiously. There must have been 20 or 30 of them at least, all pushing and fighting and lashing their tails and churning the water into a froth. Panic and pandemonium broke out immediately on top of the peach. "Oh, we are finished now," cried Miss Spider, wringing her feet. "They will eat up the old peach, and then there'll be nothing left for us to stand on, and they'll start on us." "She's right," shouted the ladybird. "We're lost forever." "Oh, I don't want to be eaten," wailed the earthworm. "But they will take me first, because I am so fat and juicy, and I have no bones." "Is there nothing we can do?" asked the ladybird, appealing to James. "Surely you can think of a way out of this." Suddenly they were all looking at James. "Think!" begged Miss Spider. "Think, James, think!" "Come on," said the centipede. "Come on, James! There must be something we can do." Their eyes waited upon him, tense, anxious, pathetically hopeful. "There is something that I believe we might try," James Henry Trotter said slowly. "I'm not saying it'll work." "Tell us!" cried the earthworm. "Tell us quick!" We'll try anything you say, said the centipede, but hurry, hurry, hurry.
Be quiet and let the boy speak, said the ladybird. Go on, James.
They all moved a little closer to him. There was a longish pause. Go on, they cried frantically, go on. And all the time while they were waiting, they could hear the sharks threshing around in the water below them. It was enough to make anyone frantic.
Come on, James,
the ladybird said, coaxing him. I'm afraid it's no good after all, James murmured, shaking his head. I'm terribly sorry. I forgot we don't have any string. We'd need hundreds of yards of string to make this work.
What sort of
string? Asked the old green grasshopper sharply. Any sort, as long as it's strong. But my dear boy, that's exactly what we do have. We've got all you want. How? Where? The silkworm, cried the old green grasshopper. Didn't you ever notice the silkworm? She's still downstairs. She never moves. She just lies there sleeping all day long. But we can easily wake her up and make her spin. And what about me, may I ask? Said Miss Spider. I can spin just as well as any silkworm. What's more, I can spin patterns. Can you make enough between you? As much as you want. And quickly? Oh, of course, of course. And would it be strong? The strongest there is. It's as thick as your finger. But why? What are you going to do? I'm going to lift the peach clear out of the water, James announced firmly.
You're mad,
cried the earthworm. It's our only chance.
The boy's crazy.
He's joking.
Go on, James,
the ladybird said gently.
How are you going to do it?
Skyhooks, I suppose, jeered the centipede. Seagulls, James answered calmly. The place is full of them. Look up there. They all looked up and saw a great mass of seagulls wheeling round and round in the sky. I'm going to take a long silk string, James went on, and I'm going to loop one end of it around a seagull's neck, and then I'm going to tie the other end to the stem of the peach. He pointed to the peach stem, which was standing up like a short, thick mast in the middle of the deck. Then I'm going to get another seagull and do the same thing, and then another and another.
Ridiculous,
they shouted.
Absurd! A whoopee-cock! Balderdash!
Madness! And the old green grasshopper said, How can a few seagulls lift an enormous thing like this up into the air? And all of us as well. It will take hundreds, thousands. There is no shortage of seagulls, James answered. Look for yourself. We'd probably need 400, 500, 600, maybe even 1,000, I don't know. I shall simply go on hooking them up to the stem until we have enough to lift us. They'll be bound to lift us in the end. It's like balloons. You give someone enough balloons to hold them, I mean really enough, then up he goes. And a seagull has far more lifting power than a balloon. If only we have the time to do it, if only we are not sunk first by those awful sharks.
You're absolutely off your head, said the earthworm. How on earth do you propose to get a loop of string around the seagull's neck? I suppose you're going to fly up there yourself and catch it.
The boy's dotty, said the centipede.
Let him finish, said the ladybird. Go on, James. How would you do it?
With bait.
Bait? Oh, what sort of bait?
With a worm, of course. Seagulls love worms. Didn't you know that? And luckily for us, we have the biggest, fattest, pinkest, juiciest earthworm in the world.
You can stop right there, the earthworm said sharply. That's quite enough.
Go on, the others said, beginning to grow interested. Go on. The seagulls have already spotted him, said James. That's why there are so many of them circling round. But they daren't come down to get him while all the rest of us are standing here. So this is what...
Stop! cried the earthworm. Stop! 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 I won't have it. I refuse.
Be quiet, said the centipede.
Mind your own business. I like that. My dear earthworm, you're going to be eaten anyway. So what difference does it make whether it's sharks or seagulls? I won't do it.
Why don't we hear what the plan is first? Said the old green grasshopper.
I don't give a hoot what the plan is, cried the earthworm. I'm not going to be pecked to death by a bunch of seagulls.
You will be a martyr, said the centipede. I shall respect you for the rest of my life. So will I, said Miss Spider. And your name will be in all the newspapers. Earthworm gives life to slave hounds. He won't have to give his life, James told them. Now listen to me. This is what we'll do.
Why, it's absolutely brilliant, cried the old green grasshopper when James had explained his plan. The boy's a genius, the centipede announced.
Now I can keep my boots on after all.
Oh, I shall be pecked to death, wailed the poor earthworm. Oh, of course you won't. I will, I know I will, and I won't even be able to see 'em coming at me because I've got no eyes.
James went over and put an arm gently round the earthworm's shoulders. I won't let them touch you, he said. I promise I won't. But we've got to hurry. Look down there. There were more sharks than ever now around the beach. The water was boiling with them. There must have been 90 or 100 at least. And to the travellers up on top, it certainly seemed as though the beach was sinking lower and lower into the water. Action stations, James shouted. Jump to it. There's not a moment to lose. He was the captain now, and everyone knew it. They would do whatever he told them to do. All hands below deck, except Earthworm, he ordered. Yes, yes, they said eagerly as they scuttled into the tunnel entrance. Come on, let's hurry. And you, Centipede, shouted James. Hop downstairs and get that silkworm to work at once. Tell her to spin as she's never spun before. Our lives depend upon it. And the same applies to you, Miss Spider. Hurry on down, start spinning. In a few minutes, everything was ready. It was very quiet now on top of the beach. There was nobody in sight, nobody except the earthworm. One half of the earthworm, looking like a great, thick, juicy pink sausage, lay innocently in the sun for all the seagulls to see. The other half of him was dangling down the tunnel. James was crouching close beside the earthworm in the tunnel entrance, just below the surface, waiting for the first of the seagulls. He had a loop of silk string in his hands. The old green grasshopper and the ladybird were further down the tunnel, holding on to the earthworm's tail, ready to pull him quickly in out of danger as soon as James gave the word. And far below in the great stone of the peach, the glowworm was lighting up the room so that the two spinners, the silkworm and Miss Spider, could see what they were doing. The centipede was down there too, exhorting them both frantically to greater efforts, and every now and again James could hear his voice coming up faintly from the depths, shouting, "Spin, silkworm! Spin like you great fat brute! Faster, faster, or we'll throw you to the sharks!" "Here comes the first seagull," whispered James. "Keep still now, earthworm, keep still. The rest of us have got you ready to pull." "Please don't let it spike me," begged the earthworm. I won't. Shh. Out of the corner of one eye, James watched the seagull as it came swooping down towards the earthworm. And then suddenly it was so close that he could see its small black eyes and its curved beak, and the beak was open, ready to grab a nice piece of flesh out of the earthworm's back. "Pull!" shouted James. The old green grasshopper and the ladybird gave the earthworm's tail an enormous tug, and like magic the earthworm disappeared into the tunnel. At the same time, up went James's hand, and the seagull flew right into the loop of silk that he was holding out. The loop, which had been cleverly made, tightened just the right amount, but not too much, around its neck, and the seagull was captured. "Hooray!" shouted the old green grasshopper, peering out of the tunnel. "Well done, James!" Up flew the seagull with James, paying out the silk string as it went. He gave it about 50 yards, and then he tied the string to the stem of the peach. "Next one!" he shouted, jumping back into the tunnel. "Up you get again, earthworm. Bring up some more silk, centipede."
"Oh, I don't like this at all," wailed the earthworm. "It only just missed me. I even felt the wind on my back as it went swishing past."
"Shh!" whispered James. "Keep still. Here comes another." And they did it again. And again, and again, and again. And the seagulls kept coming, and James caught them one after the other and tethered them to the peach stem. 100 seagulls! He shouted, wiping the sweat from his face. "Keep going!" they cried. "Keep going, James!" 200 seagulls. 300 seagulls. 400 seagulls. The sharks, as though sensing that they were in danger of losing their prey, went hurtling themselves at the peach more furiously than ever, and the peach was sinking lower and lower still in the water. 500 seagulls, James shouted.
"Silkworm says she's running out of silk,"
yelled the centipede from below.
"She says she can't keep it up much longer, nor can Miss Spider."
"Tell them they've got to," James answered. "They can't stop now." "We're lifting," somebody shouted. "No, we're not. I felt it." "Put on another seagull, quick." "Quiet, everybody, quiet. Here's one coming now." This was the 501st seagull. And the moment that James caught it and tethered it to the stem with all the others, the whole enormous peach suddenly started rising slowly up out of the water. "Look out! Here we go! Hold on, boys!" But then it stopped, and there it hung. It hovered and swayed, but it went no higher. The bottom of it was just touching the water. It was like a delicately balanced scale that needed only the tiniest push to tip it one way or the other. "One more will do it," shouted the old green grasshopper, looking out of the tunnel. "We're almost there." And now came the big moment. Quickly the 502nd seagull was caught and harnessed to the peach stem, and then, suddenly, but slowly, majestically, like some fabulous golden balloon, with all the seagulls straining at the strings above, the giant peach rose up, dripping, out of the water and began to climb towards the heavens.